Helen and Jonella. Hello, Helen and Jonella. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's seminar presentation. We are very fortunate and privileged to have Professor Alan Whitfield. Alan needs no introduction. When I first came to SAIAB many years ago, Alan was one of the role models and the people that I looked up to, including the likes of Vota, Paul Skelton, and many other people in the Institute. So it's a real pleasure and privilege for me to be introducing Alan this afternoon. Alan retired from SAIAB 8 years ago in 2018, but it still feels like it's just yesterday. But he has remained very active academically. And I've looked at Alan's publication record just for the past 5 years. It's very impressive. In 2022, Alan published 6 papers. In 2023, he published 10 papers. In 2024, he published 5 papers, which was, I think, according to Whitfield standard, it was a deep. In 2025, 8 papers. And in 2026, already there are 3 papers out. Thanks, Alan. And what is most significant about Alan's publications, most of them he is the sole author, which means we get a nice publication subsidy from that. Today, Alan will take us through one of findings from one of his recently published work that takes us on a journey into our human past. From this work, they indicate that advanced modern humans first evolved just a few kilometers from where we are here. So it's really special. And this was around 160,000 years ago, which is just very recent in geological times. And from here, they embarked on an extraordinary journey from the Cape all the way to Patagonia in only 40,000 years. So I will let Alan, take us through this, fascinating journey of, the human evolution. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Albert, and thank you, everybody, for coming to listen. I'd also like to thank Sia and Bali and Lucky for basically the technology side of this presentation. I'm a dinosaur when it comes to this sort of thing, so it's nice to have people who know how these things work. Maybe that's why I'm interested in things that are ancient. My main interest, obviously, is fish, and I've always been working in estuaries, publishing on estuarine fish. This is a bit of a journey. It's a hobby journey, and it's one that happened almost surreptitiously in a way. So to just give you a little bit of background, in 1974, I did honours at what was then the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg. And we had a professor who had recently become head of department at the University of Natal, Professor Meester. And he came from the University of Pretoria. And his speciality was small mammal taxonomy, but he had an interest in the evolution of hominids in Africa. But he wasn't allowed to teach that at the University in Pretoria. In fact, they didn't like any teaching of evolution at all. They just didn't like it. And so whether that was a reason for him to come to the University of Natal or not, I don't know. But he arrived there virtually as I was finishing my degree and went into honours. And when you're appointed as a professor, you need to do an inaugural lecture. And he chose for his inaugural lecture at the University of Natal, the human breakthrough. And the human breakthrough took place in Africa. And in those days, in the 70s, they knew quite a bit, but nothing like what we know at the moment. So that was my introduction, was in our honours course that we had with him. He gave us one lecture was totally devoted to the human breakthrough. And I remember the other people in the class were also enthralled, as I was, to learn something, because I'd never been exposed to this sort of thing in school or in my undergraduate years. There was no background information on the evolution of humans in Africa at all. Just wasn't mentioned, wasn't dealt with. And yet there was a lot of research taking place in South Africa in that period and subsequently. So then I got a job down at Whitfield in the Southern Cape, and I was into fish, and there was nothing, my mind didn't pick up on human evolution or anything like that at all. And it wasn't until the year, about the year 2000, where I reconnected with human evolution, and that was at a Department of Water Affairs workshop at the Elands River on the Tsitsikamma coast, where we were looking at the freshwater requirements of estuaries along that coast and what water could be harvested for use in that area. So it was a 3-day workshop. And I remember on the second day of the workshop, the organizers said, right, you guys need to have a break now. We're going to go down to the Elands River estuary and river and walk around and whatnot. And so we went down to the estuary up on a cliff, looking down into this beautiful estuary. And we all brought combis, and it started raining lightly. And I was walking back to the combis on a forestry path that had been cleared to stop fires. It was a fire break, which they'd bulldozed. That was like sand. And I was walking with a geologist by the name of Koos Reddering. And he walked with his head down, looking at the rocks and things like that. And the next minute, from the path, he picked up a large, beautifully made hand axe. And he handed this to me. My mouth just dropped. And he said, Alan, this is an old, early Stone Age hand axe. He said that the date of this hand axe is more than 1 million years. It's probably somewhere between 1 million and 2 million, maybe 2.5 million even, because the early hominids started making hand axes before they were homos. They were already making hand axes at that early stage. And he handed it to me, and I put it in my hand, and it just felt so right. It was like I could use this myself. And then I thought to myself, did an ancestor of mine make this, or did an ancestor of mine use this? Can't answer that question. And Koos could see me looking at it, and he said, Alan, he said, look, this has been moved from the original place, so it has no archaeological value. You can keep it. So the rain was coming down a little heavier now, and I thought about it. So I said to Koos, I said, look, I don't think I can take this. It must stay here. And I put it back where he had found it. But I would love to have kept it, because I think of that hand axe even now. That was what got me thinking now on the Southern Cape, because in all the years that I was working at Swartvlei, I was unaware of all the work that was taking place in the Southern Cape on our early human ancestors in that area. And when I say early, I'm talking Middle Stone Age, not early Stone Age, although that hand axe is from early Stone Age. So the hominid ancestors were already in the Southern Cape, as they were probably in most of Africa, 3 million, 2 million years ago, 1 million years ago. And then the Homos only arrived basically around about 500,000 years ago in different parts of Africa. So Homo neanderthalensis, which is the Neanderthal man, also came from Africa. So everybody talks about the Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, but they actually do originate from Africa, and they left Africa about 500,000 years ago. But the big breakthrough was Homo sapiens. Everybody in this room has an ancestor which goes back to Homo sapiens. And we evolved in West Africa as Homo sapiens, in Central Africa as Homo sapiens, in Southern Africa as Homo sapiens, and in Eastern Africa as Homo sapiens, okay? And we started evolving about 300,000 years ago. So our lineage, Homo sapiens, only is about 300,000 years of age. Most of the work that they've done in the Southern Cape is the last 200,000 years. So it's Middle Stone Age. They're not doing early Stone Age. They're doing Middle Stone Age and later Stone Age, but mainly Middle Stone Age. And it's in the Middle Stone Age that things started happening in the Southern Cape. And that's where a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today a lot. And this picture here, Maggie Newman, who's done quite a few pictures of these people, how they lived in that. She worked closely with the paleoanthropologists from universities, Nelson Mandela University, and so on, to make her drawings accurate and reflect what these people were doing and how they lived. And this is a picture of them on the Cape Coast feeding on intertidal seafood. Now, the intertidal seafood was one of the key things that gave the humans that lived in that area a boost. The reason for that is that the intertidal seafoods are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, which is good for brain development. So women who were pregnant, their fetuses would have an advantage, and the children that were also harvesting intertidal seafood would have also had their brains positively affected by intertidal seafoods. The men would probably be off hunting on the landward side, so they didn't benefit as much as the women. But that was regarded as being one of the triggers in terms of the advanced development of the people who lived in that area. So these people were also Homo sapiens. They were the same as Homo sapiens in other parts of South Africa, and that they weren't different. They were also Homo sapiens, but they had certain advantages, including seafoods, which the other groups did not have. So seafoods as a basic food for Homo sapiens anywhere in the world is most prevalent in the Southern Cape. I'll push the button. Okay, so do I do the right-hand button from now on? Okay, so this is the paper. So I did a draft of this paper from my reading. I then read everything I could get on the evolution of people in the Southern Cape and formed certain ideas. And then I decided, right, I think I need some co-authors who know this topic as professional scientists. And so Charles Helm, René Rust, Willow Steer, and Francis Thackeray were invited to join me on this paper. That's an open source paper, so it is freely available if you want to read the details. So I'm not going to be giving you details in this talk, but there are details available of the literature that I consulted, to almost 100 references, and also if you want to know more detail about some of the things that I'm going to tell you about. What we didn't do in that paper is go back in time. So this is going, if those of you who've been to Gauteng and been to the cradle of humankind, this is taking us back far beyond the 300,000 years when Homo sapiens evolved. It's going to our earlier hominid ancestors who probably came from East Africa, but were African-based. Everything was African-based. So Africa gave the world people. And one of the names I remembered from my honours year from Professor Meester was Paranthropus robustus. The reason I remembered that now, Paranthropus robustus lived between 2 million and 1.5 million years ago. And robustus, the name, I remember him telling us, the name is not because this person was robust. It's because their jaw was powerful. They had an incredibly powerful jaw. And the reason for that powerful jaw and very big teeth was because they ate mainly plant food, seeds and things like that. They were just ground up with this powerful jaw. And so Paranthropus got the name robustus. You'll notice that it's not Homo robustus, it's Paranthropus robustus. In other words, it's a step further back in our history. It became extinct. These were the Stone Age hand axes. So that hand axe that I picked up on the banks of the Elands River was very much like this one here. Okay, it was very similar to that, but it was better shaped. But you can see these hand axes because they're shaped on both sides. So they've knocked parts of the stone on this side, and if you turn the stone over, it's the same on the other side. It's been worked. It's been worked. And they made various shapes. This one's got more of a point, so the person would hold it at the top like that and then chop. These early hand axes were used for chopping up carcasses because we couldn't hunt animals at this stage ourselves. What we did was we used to live off dead animals. Sometimes we might have eaten animals from kills of lions and things like that, but we needed to chop the meat off and things like that. And these stone hand axes were quite useful to do that. Only later did we actually become hunter-gatherers. Now I'm going to jump forward to about 35,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens and Homo naledi were living together, not together, in different caves probably, because they didn't interbreed or anything, but they were both living in Gauteng, okay? Homo naledi, we know, lived from 335,000 years ago, but then disappeared about 236,000 years ago. So this was a cousin or distant relative, very distant relative of Homo sapiens, us, that went extinct. There are the bones, and several skeletons have been found in a cave in Gauteng of Homo naledi. They do reconstructions now. It's amazing, these reconstructions. They take the bones and then they put flesh on the bones in order to try and get an idea of what the person looked like. That is a Homo sapiens skull, an early Homo sapiens skull, and our skull looks pretty similar to that now, which is slightly different to the Homo naledi, but we both belong to the Homo genus. Now I'm coming back to the Southern Cape. Now we're into the last 160, 100,000 years ago, particularly 100,000 years ago, where people and animals lived on the Southern Cape coast, and there were a lot of sand dunes and sandy areas on the coast where animal footprints, elephants, crocodiles, you name it, giraffe, all are present in the Southern Cape in rock. That was sand about 100,000 years. It now is called Arabian rock. And this is a picture from underside of a cave. So you're looking up at the ceiling of the cave. So somebody was walking on the ceiling, and the layer of soil below the foot has fallen away so that you can actually see the foot. So you see these footprints walking across the top of the cave. And sometimes you have smaller footprints as well of children, you know, walking with the adults, okay? And this proved that there were people walking along that coast 100,000 years ago. And these are the people who I'm going to be talking about in the following slides. So during this Middle Stone Age, the working of stone got better and better. They got more sophisticated at making stone implements. This is one from Neisner. This implement here, you can see it's crafted there, but the point broke off. And obviously the person then just threw it away and made another one, because these guys could make huge numbers of stone tools in a day. And you can go to some caves and you'll just pick them up all over the place. But what is not preserved in the fossil record in terms of lithics, we call these lithics, is the shafts and the way they attach the shafts to poles to make a spear. But before the Iron Age, this is what we used in order to hunt and to fight and to defend ourselves and so on. The big breakthrough, this I maintain is the biggest thing that set the Southern Cape Homo sapiens apart from everybody else, was arrows, different designs of arrows. These are all made, they wouldn't be made, but the arrow heads are different designs that these hominins used, the Homo sapiens used in hunting. Maybe they used different ones for different animals, but that gave them an enormous advantage in terms of food, because they could now shoot from a distance, and at some stage they probably also developed the use of poisons on the arrow tips, which were even better. And that technology breakthrough was like having a nuclear weapon, because now you could outcompete any other Homo sapien you came into contact with, because you had the best weapons of anybody. And the people who left Africa to go to Europe and Asia were probably the ones who had these arrows. So they came across the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals had spears. They didn't have bows and arrows. They hadn't invented bows and arrows. So they couldn't compete with the Homo sapiens. And within a very short time, all the Neanderthals were gone. So what were the animals that they ate? So here are some of the animals that they caught or shot. One of the interesting things that right in the early stage, before they had bows and arrows, they used to eat a lot of mole rats. So somehow they developed a technique of catching mole rats, which are very abundant in the Southern Cape in those sandy soils. A mole rat is like a little bit like a dussie, a little bit it's smaller than a dussie, but it makes a meal. And so they started eating a lot of those, and then towards the end, this is in the deep cliff rock shelter, they didn't eat so many, but then they started eating many more small bovids, antelope and things like that, which they could shoot with bows and arrows. They couldn't do it in the earlier stages, but once they had bows and arrows, then they could shoot animals. But the big thing, as I said earlier, was shellfish. And these show you some of the shellfish here, that they actually consumed. They took them back to the caves, and that's how we know what they ate. And these are the main caves, 3, 4, 5, and 7 are caves where they've done a lot of collecting and monitoring of shellfish use. So here's a time scale here, going back to 170,000 years ago. And you can see that Pinnacle Point, which is a rocky coast, was the first one where they started using shellfish in a big way. And that continued from 125 to 120. And then suddenly, at about 120,000 years ago, suddenly Lombos was using rocky. Pinnacle Point was using rocky and sandy invertebrates. Pinnacle Point 9 rocky, and Classes River rocky. So this way of life of eating shellfish, it's a reliable food source. If you have droughts or anything like that, you've always can go back to the sea. And this also was the magic bullet. If you want to migrate around the world and you know how to collect shellfish from the sea, you can whiz around the world because the shellfish species change and the food source changes in terms of the composition, but you can still get food from the sea. You don't have to be reliant only on food from the land. But with bows and arrows, you can have food from the land and food from the sea. So they had the best of both worlds. And this shows you just the variety of shellfish that they were consuming on mainly rocky shores. But they'd also used to use the fynbos. Okay, so there are a lot of legumes, bulbs, and things like that in the fynbos. A lot of them are poisonous when they're raw. But if they're cooked, they're not poisonous. And we think that, or it has been proposed, that the way they discovered that cooked corms and bulbs and things like that can be consumed was after there were fires that went through the fynbos. So here, this lady's using a digging stick. You'll see a big stone, and it's got a hole in the center. And what they used to do, you'll find the stone with a hole in it. You won't find the stick anymore because the stick would have disappeared. But they used to, the heaviness of the stone enabled them to dig down for these corms. Here you can see all the corms that this lady's collected, and she's collecting some there, which they will take back to the cave. And they actually started making recipes. These people didn't just eat the vegetable matter on its own. They would mix different things and almost like have their favorite, Sunday today we'll have this and this, and we'll have some shellfish with it, They were getting more and more sophisticated. Now, what was it like in the time that they were living? So I said to you, the Middle Stone Age, okay, so this is the Middle Stone Age here from less than 300,000 years to basically about 5,000 years, very recent. The later Stone Age is the Holocene, and it's very, very recent. So most of what was happening was in the Middle Stone Age. What was the climate like down there in the Middle Stone Age? In fact, the climate in Africa was very different then to what it is now. So this dotted line over here is the present sea level, okay? The blue wavy line here is how the sea level has changed over this 300,000 years. So you can see that there were times during, for example, the last interglacial, the sea level was about 110 meters below where it is at present. When this period over here, it was 120,000. That was 20,000 years ago. Sorry, 20,000 years ago. And this was 150,000 years ago. The sea levels are very low. Reason the sea levels were low was because the northern hemisphere had massive ice sheets, kilometers thick, that sucked up all the water from the sea. So it's opposite to what we're having at the moment. We had two interglacials, which is hot periods. One was about 125,000 years ago, okay? And the other one is roughly 2,000 years ago when it got very hot and the sea level was about 7 meters above where it is now. We're now going back up into a higher, we will probably beat that one there and that one there going forward with global warming. But most of the time in this 300,000 year period, the place was cold, really cold and dry. So with dryness, you get cold. So it wasn't an easy place to live, okay? So having bows and arrows, you got an advantage, but having seafood all the time was a big advantage. You survived when other people died. So this is what the Northern Hemisphere looked like. The whole of North America, Canada, UK, most of Europe, Asia, Russia, they were all under massive, massive ice sheets, kilometers thick. And that's where the water was. And that's why the sea level was low. And the whole world was much, much colder than it is today. But in the Southern Cape, you had the Paleogallus Plain. Now, the Paleogallus Plain is underwater, is underwater now. But during those ice ages, when it was 120 meters below sea level, the plain was open and it was a wonderful place and productive environment for animals and for, not so much for invertebrates, because now your seafood, you've got to walk further to get it. But the animals, they were really, really abundant. There were giant buffalo. This is only 20,000 years ago. These buffalo were huge, the horn. You can see these two ladies here who are busy sorting bulbs and corns. There's a buffalo horn, goes right the way along like that. They were absolutely massive, these buffalo, and they were already feeding on them. This is a blauwalk, which is now extinct, which is also on the plain. This lady here, she's putting orca on as a body, what do you call it? Like a sunscreen. Sorry?
Sunscreen.
Not a sun. They didn't use it as a sunscreen. It was like, you know, they had necklaces of beads. It was making yourself look beautiful. And there you can see they mixed the orca. It comes from a rock which they ground up here, and then they put it in the perlmutt shells and mix it with oils or whatever and put it on their face, maybe to have a party. So, you know, the point is that on the Southern Cape, even in very difficult times, they were living quite well. So here's the advance. This is extracted by Marion 2015, showing how in the Southern Cape, Homo sapiens underwent a lot of advanced tick boxes. So brain size and organization, symbolic artifacts, pigments, symbolic markings, innovative technologies. All these things really started kicking in just over 100,000 years ago. So by the time we got to 70,000 years ago, which is when we proposed, they left, some of them left the Southern Cape. They were well equipped to survive in the world. And an example of this is that 100,000 years ago, they already had shoes. So this is a rock that somebody with, when I say shoes, it was this animal skin with thongs that went over the top like a bit like a slip slop. And this is showing you the depth. It's actually that image there with depth color, to show the color. And this, I maintain that the reason they wore these shoes is that when they went walking in the intertidal pools and that, to protect your feet from the barnacles and everything else, shoes are a good idea. And but they had shoes. So they were very, very advanced. And when they got into Europe, they could make clothes. You know, they could get warm if they needed to get warm. So here's some of these are beads that they would make into necklaces. Obviously, the full necklace is not available. But here's a pattern on a piece of ochre. It's a crosshatch. It was regarded as the earliest art form of Homo sapiens anywhere in the world. It's very crude, but it's the first sign that people were just sitting down and making patterns of on the ochre. And that was dated, I think it was 72,000 years ago. And here's some of the modern arrowhead, not arrowheads, spearheads and that they did. These are needles that they would use for sewing. So they could sew clothes if they wanted to, and they needed to sew clothes when they got to Europe. This is an interesting one. This is where I was pulled in by Charles Helm, because they're not ichthyologists, and he wanted to know a bit more about the blue stingray. So this cast here, which is was originally a sand sculpture on the beach. Okay, it was found on the beach, minus its tail. Tail was chopped off. So it's this, and what we did is we overlaid a picture of a blue stingray, which in summer they come into the inshore waters of the Southern Cape. They're good eating. J.L.B. Smith, in his book, he says, blue stingray, good eating. Plasmobranchs that normally aren't good eating, but this particular species is. It's lethargic, but it's got a big barb over here, which is dangerous. So we didn't put this in the scientific paper, but some of the ideas we had and discussed were this. The tail might have been present originally, didn't look like it had been broken off, but that it was, remember, just in a sand cast initially before it became rock, but the tail was gone. Maybe these guys removed the tail because that is what could kill them. If they stood on one of these blue stingrays and the spike got in your leg, it was probably history for you. You would die from blood poisoning and so on in time. The other thing we noticed was the cut marks all in the longitudinal section of the ray with some spike holes as well. Was there a ritual that took place before these guys went and hunted this dangerous animal? They said, okay, we're removing your power to spike us, and we're coming. We don't know. We'll never know the answer, and you can't put it in a scientific paper. That's why you think these cuts are there, because they used a spear that they actually used to hunt the stingrays in the process. You just don't know. Okay, so what about this movement of hominins into and out of Africa? Because the Homo sapiens that left Africa to take over the world, there's general agreement amongst the paleoanthropologists that they left at about 50,000 years ago, 50, 60, maybe 40,000 years ago. That period is quite late, but before that, there was a lot of movement of hominids. I mentioned the Neanderthals. There were also Denisovans. So in this part of Asia, there were Denisovans who were a bit like the Neanderthals, there for a long time, for hundreds of thousands of years, far longer than Homo sapiens. So that they would move into these areas, and some of them actually came back to Africa, but they all came from Africa. Now, this is the key, the 50,000, what happened in 50,000 years ago. So the geneticists say, and the paleoanthropologists say, and they've put in print, 50,000 years ago, immigration took place from East Africa across to the Arabian Peninsula, then up into Europe, down into India, down into Australia, up into Asia, Russia, and then across to North America and down. Okay, we agree with that. But we question that they came from East Africa. There's a big fixation amongst paleoanthropologists because a lot of the early hominids came from East Africa and have been found in East Africa, that the latest Africans who left Africa came from there as well. We say no, they came from down here. So this is the genetics. So look at this. Haplotype L3, L3, L3. Why have they got the arrow only going from L3 from East Africa? Why is it not possible that L3 also went from Southern Africa? Okay, that turns it right. So this paper from Bayen 2011 doesn't even mention the possibility that the L3 haplotype came from Southern Africa. There's another thing that happened 74,000 years ago. So I said they left the Southern Cape 70,000 years ago. So they were sitting down in Southern Cape. But a super volcano, and I'm talking a real super volcano in Indonesia, Mount Toba. It was so huge that it blotted out the sun for years, such that the vegetation in the tropical areas around the world basically died or was decimated. In other words, it might not have been eliminated completely, but anybody living in the tropics had anybody living in that round the equator would have been severely compromised by this event because of the effect it has on the food and the food chains in that area. But the Southern Cape Homo sapiens were not affected. We know that. As you came further south, things were pretty much the same. So they could carry on advancing 74,000 years ago. So why did they leave the Cape? If this Garden of Eden, what does it leave? One, declining air and water temperature as the Ice Age develops. The place is becoming cold. They know that the water coming down from the Agulhas is warm into the Southern Cape. Guys, let's walk up in that direction and go and have a warmer climate. We're getting bloody cold here. Time to get declining rainfall and freshwater availability as climate changes. So as the region got colder and drier, less fresh water available, more difficult to live. Fresh water is just absolutely essential. Changing shoreline means constantly moving home. So you're living in this cave, and now you're the sea coast is retreating. So if you were in Knysna 120,000 years ago, the coast was 80 kilometers away from the heads. So you have to walk a long way if you want to go and get shellfish in that, and if you want to stay at Knysna. So you've got to move with the coast if you want to carry on eating shellfish. Success of all Southern Cape modern humans means increased competition for food and other resources. So the downside of all these guys now getting modern technology, they've all got bows and arrows, is that you're competing. You're very successful, your reproductive rate is good, family sizes, mortality is low, you're doing well, but the competition is getting more and more. Ability and ease to successfully migrate along the exposed shore to warmer climates and new territories in the northeast. Walking along a beach is the easiest way of moving along big distances, limited predators, so not so many lions on the beach, not so many hippos, things that kill people. You on the beach, you've got pretty free rein, you've got wide vision, you can see things that are coming towards you, and you've got bows and arrows, remember. Intertidal seafood is always available along the coast. Big one, big one. If you know how to collect seafood, you will survive. Many of the shipwrecks in the 17th, 18th centuries and that along our coast, the people died of starvation before they could get to Maputo or to the Cape because they didn't know how to collect seafood. Intertidal seafood was advanced arrow technology means coastal bovids also easily accessible as a food resource. So you can have intertidal seafood and you can go and shoot antelope as well. Freshwater readily available all along the African coastline. If you walk along a coastline, a lot of seeps, aquifers and that are always present along the lowest part of a of a contour. So fresh water will generally be readily available near the coast. If you go further inland, you're going to go across deserts and places like that where there's no water and you're in trouble. Little competition from surviving hominins in Eastern Africa. So Eastern Africa was hard hit by the Mount Toba eruption. So these guys walking along the beach probably had a pretty easy time of it. Declining sea level means narrow crossing from the Horn of Africa region to the Arabian Peninsula. So it's been shown that at about 50, 60,000 years ago, at the Horn of Africa, because of the lower sea level, the Arabian Peninsula and Africa were much, much closer. In fact, you could, I won't say swim across it, you need some sort of assistance with a log boat of some sort that you could make and catch the wind, and it's only a few kilometers and you'll be on the other side. So getting across to the Arabian Peninsula would not have been a problem 50,000 years ago. So this is the timeline we propose. The dark brown is the coastal shelf at 120 meters below. So one is departure from the Southern Cape about 70,000 years, leaving Southern Africa about 65, arriving Eastern Africa about 60, and out of Africa approximately 50. That is our hypothesis of how the sequence occurred. And if people are not staying in permanent caves and things like that, moving quickly and long distances is very, very easy. So although there are a lot of caves here, if you go up to northern KwaZulu-Natal or Mozambique, there's not a lot of caves around to live in for any length of time. So you would be continually moving along the coast. Now, this is now getting to an interesting part about this East African story. So this map, which is from Google 2007, he says the early spread of humans between 60 and 40,000 years ago are the blue lines, okay? Then he says the red lines, later spread of modern humans from West Asian source, 45,000 to 35,000 years ago. So these red lines show humans that had already left here, now starting to move elsewhere. He doesn't take them all the way around, but that time frame makes sense. But here's an interesting one. So here's the center where they say the Africans that left Africa came from. We say, no, they came from here. And he's got an arrow, a red arrow, which is the 45 to 35,000 years, going from East Africa to the Eastern Cape. And it's a place quite close to here, a town called Homo. And the skull that was found there has been called the Homo skull, or Hoffi. And that skull, the contents inside the skull, have been aged at 36,000 years ago. This skull is most similar to the humans, Homo sapiens, who left Africa and went up through the Arabian Peninsula into Asia and Africa. So this skull is very, very similar. And our hypothesis is that this was one of the people that stayed behind. Not everybody went walking up the coast to go out of Africa. There were people who stayed in the Southern Cape as well. Whether they lasted, we don't know. But this skull and the measurements, they've done incredibly detailed studies on the skull all over the world, trying to take genetic samples and all that sort of thing. They've really gone in great detail to look at this particular skull because it matches most closely the people that left and went up to Europe and Asia. So Kevin Cole, who's the scientist at East London Museum, he said of the skull, that skull is in East London Museum. It is believed that the Upper Paleolithic peoples descended from a population that emigrated from sub-Saharan Africa, correct, in the late Pleistocene, 40 to 60,000 years. The Homo skull thus connects the origins of people in Europe to Africa, giving more credence to the out of Africa theory. So Kevin Cole is not saying East Africa is the place to be. And if you look at the lithics in East Africa, the lithics in East Africa show the Howson's Poort and still by technologies of stone tools only arrived in East Africa about 50,000 years ago. We maintain that those technologies, those stone tools that were found in East Africa around about 50,000 years ago, came from here. They didn't evolve in East Africa. They evolved down here. Okay, so for those of you who live in Asia or in Europe, these are your ancestors from Africa, about 45,000 years ago. You'll see they've already made themselves quite warm clothing because they don't like the cold, but there's snow all over the place and it's pretty cold. And they've adapted well to the environment. Very quickly, they would start losing their dark skins and have light skins like this, because then you can get, what's it, vitamin B? E. E. Okay. Because a dark skin actually repels the sunlight from getting into your body and giving you that vitamin. By actually having a lighter skin, it can penetrate into your body. So that's one of the adaptations that we would have had to make in terms of living in Europe and Asia. So here's a fairly comprehensive map, which I think shows it quite nicely. It gives the whole sort of link. So even here, this map doesn't say we came from down here. It's saying 200,000 years ago, and that's correct. Homo sapiens, 300,000 to 200,000 years ago, just in Africa, all of us, Africa. But from 50,000 years ago, they've got a date here saying 70,000 years ago into the Arabian Peninsula, then 65,000 up to here, 45 to Asia, 40, 30, up into the Arctic areas, 12, late colonization, 25, we crossed the Bering Straits, down into North America, 16,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago, we made South America, and very quickly, we were right down in Patagonia, because people can move very, very quickly. You don't need thousands of years, you just need hundreds of years of walking to get from A to B. The interesting thing is, this map also proposes that New Zealand was only colonized about 1,000 years ago, and some of the islands in the Pacific were also only 1,000 years ago. And it's from the Polynesian people who had good seafaring abilities where they could travel long distances. And they possibly colonized. There's even a hypothesis that they colonized Madagascar about 2,000 years ago. A lot of this still has to be proven, but this gives you an idea of the complexity. Here's Iceland, 1,000 years ago, where was a colonization. All this colonization, these colonials who have an explorer just in the last few hundred years, suddenly finding North America, that's not true. America was colonized 16,000 years ago. North and South America 14,000 years ago. So who's this? This is they did a reconstruction with the bones from Europe, and one of the characteristics of the Neanderthals, I don't think it's shown so well in this skull, is they had very big, heavy eyebrows, and they had big noses. So they actually did interbreed with modern Homo sapiens. So the modern Homo sapiens came into contact with these guys, and I was reading a scientific article the other day where it said some of the Homo sapiens women were attracted to these guys, and they had babies with them, and some of them were viable. So the end result is anybody here or who comes from Europe, you have, I think it's 2 or 3% of Neanderthal genes in you, okay? Whereas Albert doesn't have Neanderthal genes in him. He's a good, solid African. But these guys, in the process of mixing with us, they became extinct. So they met the Homo sapiens from Africa about 40,000 years ago, and by about 30,000 years ago, they were all gone. No more Neanderthals left, and yet they had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, and they disappeared soon after they had contact with Homo sapiens. So there's some stories to be told there. And this is an artistic picture showing the route, the traveling that we did. So this guy's got arrows on his arm and maps of the world. It's not a real map. It's not a real person. He's also, I see the artist has used a light skin. So already he's been living in Europe or in Northern Asia or whatever for quite some time. And the pigment has gone from his skin. And he's becoming a paler version of his African ancestors. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Quite a fascinating piece of investigative research there. Forensics, it's nice to be in retirement, I guess. I think we'll open for questions for Alan, both colleagues online and those that have joined online and in the room. Yes, Fusi. And welcome, Fusi.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thanks, Alan, for fascinating talk. Actually, as much as you know my background of having been in the field of theology and so forth, but during the times when Philip was still alive, I used to follow his field a lot. If we just from out of interest, it occurred actually if you read some other articles, they also said or tell that the Homo sapiens actually and those what you call it is Denisovans, yes, and the one that named the terms, sort of like they appear to have evolved from what you call the Homo. It's a Homo heidelbergensis.
Yes.
Any thought about that? I mean, I always find it quite fascinating.
Yeah. Look, the Homo tree and the hominid tree. It's basically like a tree with branches. And many of the branches went extinct. Heidelbergensis went extinct. Homo erectus went extinct. In other words, those branches withered and disappeared, never to be seen again. In our case, we persisted and we partially absorbed some of Homo neanderthalensis before they disappeared. So the branches interweave, they disappear, die. There's good evidence, for example, they talk about Java man, which apparently they reckon disappeared in the Java region, was that they were very small people and not big populations, and they lived on islands where everything else was small as well. And they died out fairly recently. Well, even the Neanderthals disappeared 30,000 years ago. It's not a long time ago. So, but the point of the matter is that there have been huge numbers of different homos in different areas that have disappeared. But Homo sapiens, everybody here, have survived and grown and flourished and taken over the world. That's essentially what's happened.
Thanks, Alan. Yes, Janelle.
So if one of the reasons that they left Southern Africa was more of moving from a colder region to a warmer region, and now given that we've got different seasons, do you know if they moved from Europe back to Southern Africa when the conditions were favorable?
Okay, the Homo sapiens, when they left Africa, there's no strong evidence of them coming back to Africa. There may have been some movement from the Sinai Peninsula area, Israel, where, in other words, they went up that way and they colonized those areas of what they call the Levant. But there's no strong evidence. The big movement was out of Africa and then around the world. It was an outward movement, not one coming back. I would say, if you were to make an analogy to colonialism, essentially what colonialism is, a lot of those people coming back to Africa, they don't know that Africa was actually their ancestral home, but they're coming back to Africa. So if you did genetics, you'd say, oh, we've got some of these guys coming back now. Meanwhile, I would say most of the occupation of the world has been in a one-way direction. Even with the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, there was evidence of return sort of migrations coming back to Africa, but they never established themselves in any numbers the way they did in Asia and Europe. That was their, what do you call it, their core area. And they became adapted to living in cold conditions, whereas Africa was much warmer. So the Africans that left Africa, they had to adapt to much permanent colder climates. And in many areas, they wouldn't have access to seafoods. So they would have to become innovative in terms of the way they collected food and harvested food. They'd have to become innovative in terms of competition with other people that lived in those areas, including the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, who'd lived in those areas for a very long time and lived in caves which the Homo sapiens would probably want.
Thanks, Alan. Any? Yes.
Thank you so much. I have a question. We have lots of science to prove our hypothesis about this expansion of people, our ancestors from Southern Africa to other parts of the world. What do you think the last proof, the final sign to show us this is the true thing, this is the correct thing? And you call a historical spear from Southern Africa. What do you think?
Okay, one of the big issues around this traveling out and along the coast in particular is that a lot of the traveling happened when the sea level was low. So a lot of the evidence of these travels are under the water. They're not. We're fortunate in the Southern Cape of having caves which we can examine the transformation over time of these people and then their advancement. But the main evidence that we moved up the East African coast is actually under the water. It's not inland, because they didn't go overland. If they'd gone overland, we would find the tools and all the rest of it. As I said earlier, the only tools that link to Southern Africa, and I'm talking about Howson's Poort technology, which is just down the road here. You ever think why Stone Crescent Hotel is called Stone Crescent? Because they made one of their specialities with little stone crescents. Beautiful. That was later Stone Age. They were found in East Africa 50,000 years ago, but there's no trail of those technologies moving from Southern Africa to East Africa. They probably came up the coast with the Homo sapiens from Southern Africa, and that's why they arrived there at about 50,000 years ago. And then those tools are also found on the Arabian Peninsula and on the way to Australia. So that says to me, looking at the stone tools, and that's one of the few things we've got to work with, was they are reflective of different technologies, that those people came from here.
Thanks, Alan. I think just as a follow-up on that one, maybe with the advancements that are happening, the genetic techniques, hopefully with those skulls and all, yeah.
Yeah, at the moment, the geneticists, they can do skulls and bones, I think to about 12,000 years ago, 15,000. They can't go back hundreds of thousands of years ago. So they're limited with the technology. Maybe it'll change in the future, but at the moment, for example, in the Southern Cape, there's a shelter, Oakhurst Rock Shelter near Hookville in the Southern Cape, where they excavated skeletons from the 1930s, which were lodged in Cape Town, at the University of Cape Town. And those bones have been genetically examined over a period of about 12,000 years.
Okay.
And they say that those people remained relatively constant during that entire period. And the needle is pointing to the San people living in that cave. They were hunter-gatherers. They weren't Khoi. In other words, they had no cattle, sheep, or goats. They lived on animals and intertidal seafood. And they also had plant material, as I explained over there. So the feeling is that those people that lived in that cave were a fairly uniform group, and they were the San for that period from genetics.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
And the San, were they left over from the guys that migrated north?
Okay.
How do the people that
The San were interacting in the Southern Cape hundreds of thousands of years ago, and the San occupied mostly the central part of southern Africa, going up into Botswana, and they were around for the last 100,000 years in particular. Now, when things started getting really cold, the San used to come down to the coast in winter to feed on intertidal food, and they go back up into the Karoo in that in summer when there was rainfall and things were more plentiful. But eventually they started being permanent residents in the Southern Cape, and this Oakhurst bone thing over the last 12,000 years supports the hypothesis that the San became permanent residents in the Southern Cape 12,000 years ago. But the San were in Central and Southern Africa, including linking up with people in Southern Cape over at least the last 200,000 years.
I think, Alan, from your presentation, there are quite a number of species that have gone extinct, and we are the only one that's remaining. And that's really beginning to concern us that there could be that possibility and the risk of also this particular species going extinct. What could be that major thing that can potentially, take away?
Well, if we have more people like Trump, he could send us into a spiral, and in a very short time, Homo sapiens would be in trouble if conflict and everything took over, and the world, let's say, got involved in a nuclear war. It's not a happy scenario. Fortunately, the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens couldn't do that. They just had bows and arrows and spears. But the technology we have now is frightening, and sometimes we're not so intelligent. So the sapiens part is not always the most.
So we can potentially self-destruct. That's what you're saying.
I think it's possible if you look at the behavior of some of our species.
Yes, not.
Every time I drive past there, I know where it is. I drive past, I say to myself, I'm always on my way between my house and the grandson. I said, I must actually go back there and have a look and see if I can find it, because it was on the sand where I left it. Look, it's almost certainly they grade these things from time to time. But I think I've got a good idea of where it is, and I might one day go back. Yes, I have thought about it.
Yes, yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned about the breeding between the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals. I can see why the female Neanderthals would want to breed with the Homo sapiens. Why would the Homo sapiens breed with the Neanderthals?
Well, they said in this article, they said it wasn't the other way around. In other words, the Neanderthal women weren't attracted to the Homo sapiens men. Yeah. But it was, so most of the genetic incorporation into Homo sapiens was through Homo sapiens women having mated with the Neanderthal man.
What was like sexually favorable about the Neanderthals?
I don't know, you saw a picture of
The big nose. Right. There are no questions online, and Alan.
I have two, if possible, please.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Alan, the first one was that the morphological characteristics of the people in the painted reconstructions seem more similar to the San and the Khoi people than to the Nguni peoples. Was that just coincidental or intentional in the reconstructions?
Okay, the San and the Khoi people were down in the Southern Cape, particularly the San people were down in the Southern Cape together with this Homo sapiens tribe, if you want to call it that, who were down there at that time. The Bantu Nguni people arrived in the last 1,000 years in the Eastern Cape and never really got into the Western Cape. They made it as far as some parties might have made it to Knysna, but they occupied the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal and entered South Africa approximately 2,000 years ago. So they are a recent arrival into the Southern Cape, and therefore I wouldn't expect to find skeletal features of Bantu or Nguni ancestral people showing up in, for example, the Hoffman skull or in the San or the Khoi. The San and the Khoi were overlapping in Botswana and places like that with the Bantu earlier, that they were a very wide group and they had a different lifestyle of hunter-gathering compared to the Bantu and Nguni, who initially were pastoralists mainly. And in fact, Nguni cattle were a very late introduction, which may have come about as a exchange between the Khoi and the Zulus in particular. So that image of lots of cattle coming down from Central and Eastern Africa is not necessarily correct in terms of occupation, particularly of KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. That was a later development. So I'm not surprised that the skull shape, because the Khoi and the San have very similar skull shapes, and there are parallels between the Hofmeyr skull, or there's similarities. But as I said, the Hofmeyr skull is also similar to the skull of the people that left Africa. So these people were all mixing. I think if we do DNA analysis of people now, I'm talking about lineages who went to Europe, you might find that there's actually some San lineage as well. In other words, there's some San genes as well as Neanderthal genes. Doesn't mean to say that they're not there.
And then the Bantu-speaking peoples who came down got as far as the Kaskama River,
Yes.
because they grew sorghum and the rainfall became too erratic south of that for them to continue. So that is where they stopped, and they had to plant in river valleys. The water, the food.
Yeah, I did. My reading said they came as far as the Frontis, and not to the west of that. Although there were parties that might have gone as far as Knysna, but they didn't ever settle in that Southern Cape. Because the Khoi also had cattle, and they didn't occupy permanently the area that the Southern Cape San people occupied. So the Khoi were the first people in the Western Cape that Van Riebeck and all the rest of them came. They didn't come into contact with the San. They came into contact with the Khoi. The people of they called them the people of the cattle herd people.
Yeah.
And that was because they had big herds of cattle. They could get the cattle to fight for them in a battle. They were amazing.
Yeah.
And as I say, the hypothesis was that they interacted with the Nguni before they got down into the Southern Cape in terms of cattle exchange and that's where the Nguni cattle come from in the Zulu tradition. Yeah.
Thanks, Alan. We can sit down and listen to Alan for the next 3 hours.
May I please ask one more question?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you so much. Aside from the cave at Pinnacle Point, are there any other sites that the public can visit?
A lot of the caves, I know the caves, for example, on Robberg Island, you can look at them, but you can't go into them and fossick around. They essentially closed to the public. I think only scientists would be allowed to go in to do work, simply because if you allow public into some of these places and they come up with a new research tool they want to implement, if the cave has been damaged or things have been moved around too much, the value of the deposits become less.
Alan, just one last one, quick one from me. Why is the Hofi called the smoking gun? What is it called?
Okay, so the Hofmeyr skull is an indication that some of those Homo sapiens that left up the coast, that we proposed left up the coast, some of them didn't go up the coast. Some of them stayed behind.
Okay.
And that skull was found in a riverbed. It wasn't found in town of Hofmeyr. It was found in the riverbed of the Vlekpoort River, embedded inside of it's a dry riverbed.
Okay.
And as I said, they were able to date it. They've never found any other skulls. And interestingly enough, they haven't found much in the way of skeletal material of the people that lived in the Southern Cape. Part of the answer to that is Most of the graves are on the Paleogallus Plain, which is underwater. The other hypothesis is that they were buried in dunes and things like that, which tend to get eroded and moved around. It's not like they were put in coffins and buried in the cave. The interesting thing is Homo naledi did bury their both young people that had died and older people that died deep in the cave where they were living, which doesn't seem to have been the pattern for the Homo sapiens that lived in the Southern Cape. They seem to have different habits in terms of burying your dead.
Thank you, Alan. I will close on that note, and thank you, everyone, those that have joined online and those that have joined here in the room. Thank you so much. Thanks, Alan, for always sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you.